Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with the Game Week 1 cheat sheet. If you guys are new to the channel, the cheat sheet is a video series where I go week to week looking at the best options in each position at FPL, the midfielders, the goalkeepers, the defenders, and the forwards. And I continuously update this list and sheet of players, looking at who's moving up the cheat sheet, moving from the S tier or moving down to the C tier, looking at options that are more interesting because of how fixtures are changing, and also tactically maybe some of the amendments that we're seeing from some managers. If we start with this cheat sheet, I'm going to start with the midfielders. Ultimately, the midfielders have the most amount of flexibility, even though it seems like a lot of options are nailed this year. I know a lot of people have Bailey and Neto and Martinelli in their drafts. Obviously, Salah as the premium. There is still a lot of variety when we compare positions, especially when we're looking at defenders and forwards, where it seems like people are really set on some of the premiums that we have at our disposal. If we look at the 4.5 options, I would say Pereira is a fantastic pick to go with as your 4.5. There's no reason not to get him. He's going to be playing behind Mitrovic and probably going to be one of the key players in terms of goal and chance creation for this Fulham side. So ultimately, even if you think Fulham's going to be a weak team, there's going to be select weeks where you might even think about starting him, or at least be confident in him being someone coming off the bench for you. So game week 3 versus Brentford being a key example. And ultimately, as I said, even if Fulham are struggling as a team, they will inevitably score some goals, and Andreas Pereira probably is the most nailed option out of all the 4.5 picks to even have any goal involvements whatsoever. The next best option, therefore, is Colback from Nottingham Forest. Nottingham Forest is actually one of the sides that have strengthened the most in this offseason. I would say compared to Bournemouth and Fulham, they've had a lot more transfers, getting players like Jesse Lingard in. It definitely does show that they have ambition to try and stay up this season, and they've spent money to sort of back that up. Colback is an option who's going to be playing 85 to 90 minutes a game for sure in the midfield. I don't really expect too many goal involvements from him, but that's what he's going to provide for you. Someone who's going to come off the bench and provide 2 points. If you're going for, let's say, a midfield structure with 3 midfielders or even 2 midfielders, if you're going super risky and going for a 5-2-3, ultimately Colback is going to be that second 4.5 pick that you're looking at. At 5.0 to 5.5, yes, I think the key template options are Bailey and Neto, and simply put, Bailey is an interesting option because he's been a productive player, I would say, ever since he became a young star, or became a young star in Leverkusen, and he's even had a double-digit season in the Bundesliga. The only thing holding him back for his career has been injuries, and unfortunately that was something that blighted his season last year as well. We saw individual games where he would come back from injury or start the season as well with fantastic goal contributions, and he looked in really great shape, but he was never able to sort of maintain his body and stay fit. This preseason he has, and he's played a lot of games, and he's gotten into Gerrard's XI, and I think he's been the key player. If you look at a game like the United game, completely changed the game, and Gerrard has been incredibly complimentary of him. That 1 goal, 1 assist highlight is something I'd definitely look at to get a feel for what Bailey could be like as a player potentially. And ultimately, if you're banking on the fact that he's fit and looking at the short-term fixtures of Aston Villa, game weeks 1 to 4 are fantastic for them. Then it kind of nosedives a little bit for Aston Villa, so keep in mind that will affect things. But I do think Bailey is a fantastic option to open the season with, especially if you want to save a little bit more money from the 5.5 options. Neto is going to be that 5.5 option that everyone's looking at to start with. Ultimately, Wolves have very clean games from games 1 to 8, and unlike Aston Villa, there is no nosedive in the sense of the fixtures. You could arguably keep Neto for the first half of the season up until your wild card, and he could provide a lot of value for you if he does well. One key thing is Jimenez is injured, and another thing too is I think people are dismissing how inactive and uncreative Wolves were as a team last season when they were trying to get a lot of clean sheets and play defensive football and keep games low scoring. That's going to be one factor, I would say, and it kind of has reflected as well within the preseason. There have been some low scoring games, and I would kind of expect that to be around the standard of Wolves this season. I can't imagine a dramatic shift tactically for them, unless I'm wrong. And maybe if that's the case, then Neto is 100% the pick to own. But I think there is enough of an argument to switch between Bailey and Neto. Another option as well for a lot of FPL team structures is to go for both options. Ultimately, Bailey is at such a cheap price that you could even arguably think about him as a 5.0 bench option and maybe even think about rotating him. Aronson for me is a 5.5 pick who is probably the second best compared to someone like Neto. If you don't fancy Wolves and you don't fancy their style of play, then why not move into a team like Leeds that historically have shown to be very positive and very chaotic and creative. If you look at a game like the Cagliari preseason game, that was a game that could have at one point seen Leeds concede 3 goals. Ultimately, they themselves scored 4, and that's sort of what Leeds will hopefully bring to the table. We are expecting a little bit more defensive formidability from the defensive transfers such as Roca, and even getting Tyler Adams, getting that partnership set up. as well as them signing a new right back, but I still think they lack a left back. And as I said, looking at the Cagliari game, they could have even conceded 3. That is a little bit worrisome, but when you're looking at someone who's a creative outlet such as Aronson, he's such a creative and technical player that I really like him. He kind of reminds me, as I said, of Ramsey, someone who can drive into the box at times and pick out a fantastic pass. The difference, of course, is Ramsey was someone who we saw score quite often. I would say Aronson is someone who could be a very, very creative mastermind with this Leeds team. And you have another option in Rodrigo just in the next price bracket to think about too when you're thinking about goal scorers from this Leeds side. Almiron and Podence are your next best 5.5 options. I don't really like Podence because he's a very technical player, but he has historically shown to be a very, very poor finisher. On the other hand, Almiron has had highs and lows. He's had individually great games. He looks like a physically very, very kind of oppressive player because he's so fast at times and it's so hard to get the ball off him. And he's shown that fantastic preseason form with 6 goals and 2 assists, but I'm just not really sure if you'd like to start the season with him. Ultimately, I'd probably prefer at 5.0 to go with someone like Bailey and then move into Almiron if it seems like he's been able to keep his preseason form up. One thing that I like about Bailey is, for me, he's the second best or even first best Aston Villa asset right now, if fit. When you contrast that to Almiron, you still have options like, say, Maximan and even Callum Wilson to compete with, even Wood as well. And that, for me, makes it really tough to go for an option like Almiron to start the game with, just because there's so many competing players who will be taking and demanding the ball. Even Bruno, who's competing with him in the 6.0, 6.5 bracket. And as we move into that bracket, Martinelli and Trossard are my best options. For me, Martinelli is the best 6.0 in the game by far. He is someone who, with this Arsenal team, has started the preseason off incredibly hot. He's gotten 5 assists so far. He takes the left-sided corners for Arsenal, and that's exactly why he's such an interesting asset. He is someone who's very creative. You can see him take plenty of crosses, and he's very direct and very accurate with them, so that's a huge plus, especially for a team that has now strengthened in terms of their set-piece strength, in my opinion. Moving Ben White to the right-back position, you now have another much larger frame in William Saliba, who could hopefully score some corner goals this season, and Martinelli will be the one to benefit in that sort of situation. Trossard is going to be another fantastic option to look at 6.5. I know a lot of people are going to be looking at Trossard and thinking, Trossard, really? But a lot of the algorithms have actually spit out Trossard as a top option. He is going to be the talisman of the Brighton team. After moving into the 3-back structure, he has improved tremendously. Last season, if you look at his stats specifically towards the tail end of the season, he did do incredibly well, and Brighton have stuck within the structure. So I really think that Brighton could be the team to look at, and especially Trossard too, who might be in the form of his life. And barring, let's say, the game week 1 poor game versus Man United, they have a pretty good run of schedule, and I really like Trossard to think about as a differential. Rashford is another option who could have an incredibly high ceiling this year. One of the doubters that doubts that I have with Rashford really is his expected minutes. He is not someone who is an absolute priority to start within this United team. He is, like many other players within this United squad, as someone who is probably trying to prove himself towards Ten Hag, but I wouldn't say he's not nailed. I'd say someone like Sancho, who is dealing with illness right now, is probably a little bit more nailed than someone like Rashford. Even Martial, with the Cristiano Ronaldo situation going on, is someone who I would expect to start more. And just looking at the preseason games, yes, Rashford has had some goals, but we've also seen some really poor results from Man United. So I think you're kind of taking a bet here on a team that ultimately still needs probably a little bit of time to develop under this new manager, and Rashford is probably the 3rd best option in this team. So I would probably, at this point, think about avoiding Rashford. Odegaard is a fantastic pick, but he does seem a little bit costly to me, and just because Martinelli exists as a 6.0 option, I really can't fathom Odegaard as the pick to go for at 6.5. He has been involved in some very interesting positions. I think looking at his Chelsea goal, that's a key example of how Martinelli plays a bit of a creative, deeper role sometimes, and someone like Odegaard can push into the box and score. But I can't see Odegaard being a better option than Martinelli overall. I just think Martinelli will consistently be in better positions. If you look at the amount of chances that Martinelli, for example, has occupied as kind of that last man standing or that second striker within this Arsenal system, he's had plenty of chances to give people tap-ins, and that's how Martinelli got a few assists. There was even one chance where they were 1-on-2 versus Chelsea, or 2-on-2 rather, and Martinelli could have laid the ball off to Saka, who took a pretty poor shot early in the game. And that's the kind of positions that Martinelli occupies. It's not very often Odegaard does himself, and it's not very often that he does arrive in the box. He probably provides more of a creative piece as well, similar to Martinelli, but I just don't see him being that involved in comparison. Bruno Guimaraes is an interesting pick, but similar to Almiron, I'm just not really interested in going for Newcastle assets early on. They do have tough games, games 3 and 5 versus Liverpool and City, and ultimately, I just think there's too much of the ball being shared around by a lot of good players, and I'm not that confident in a player like Bruno Guimaraes. I don't see Newcastle's attacking ceiling being quite as high as a team like Arsenal as a comparison. Lingard is another interesting pick. We did see previous brief stint with West Ham what he could look like as the talisman of a team. I imagine he will be like that with Nottingham Forest, especially playing alongside some players like Johnson and Awoniyi. But I just think you're still banking on a lot here. You're expecting Nottingham Forest to perform incredibly well, and we still haven't seen them make that step up to the Premier League. They've had a good preseason so far, but not enough for me to say Lingard's a fantastic pick to start with. The same thing goes with Rodrigo, who's had a really good preseason. Ultimately, I would say he is someone who's quite at threat of being substituted if Leeds are having a poor game. And we know that preseason doesn't always tell the tale of the tape. Yes, Rodrigo has had a good season. He had a hat-trick versus Cagliari, but that doesn't mean much. I think someone like Bamford is much more interesting overall because he has those expected minutes. You expect him to play at least 85 to 90 minutes as long as he gets to stay fit, and he's had a preseason under his belt, so I imagine Bamford will hopefully stay fit. When you're contrasting with someone like Rodrigo, I can see him being subbed off at 60 minutes if he's not having a good game. That's kind of why I've priced him as a differential. With St. Maximin, I just think he's a little bit expensive as well. Once again, too much sharing of the ball, and as I said previously in my cheat sheet videos, I just think he plays a little bit worse when Callum Wilson is involved in the play, and I really like St. Maximin when he's involved in central areas, and I can't see him occupying those spaces when you have both Wood and Wilson competing for that central spot too, and he has to play probably on the wings to create, and just won't be worth that 6.5 price. The move to the midfield position is very interesting, but definitely an option I'd like to think about a little bit later. Sancho is the top pick that I have in the 7.0 to 7.5 price bracket. Why I like Sancho so much is conditional based on him being fit, really. He's had a really exciting preseason so far. Ultimately, I think he probably keeps his position. If, let's say, Ronaldo is someone who comes back into the team, I can see Martial playing minutes on the bench if Ronaldo finally finds some fitness and actually is willing to play with United. Whereas Sancho, I would say, is probably, at this point in the season and the preseason so far, the most interesting United asset under Ten Hag. Arguably, Bruno stands to be one of those options too, but Sancho's at an incredible price at 7.5, where if United were to kick on this season and Sancho was to continue improving at United, he has really good trajectory and is at a really good price, being cheaper than some of the other 8.0 mid to have a fantastic season. Zaha is one that I've priced in the tier below. He has terrible fixtures, so definitely not someone I would immediately start the season with, even though he's been so hot in the preseason. But definitely he will be the talisman of this Crystal Palace side. Yes, they've lost Gallagher, but I think Ezekiel Eze being fit and having a preseason under Patrick Vieira, and also them getting a few, I would say, upgrades and signings with players like Chris Richards, as an example, and even Doucouré, will be a significant upgrade enough for Crystal Palace to do well when their fixtures ease up. And that's exactly when I would probably think about moving Zaha to an S tier option. And I think he might even score, for example, in some games like in the Arsenal game, even the Aston Villa game. But yeah, when you have Liverpool and City in your fixtures, definitely not someone to start with, but it's definitely someone to keep on your watch list. Barnes, Grealish, and Coutinho, not super interested in them as options. I just think they're a little bit overpriced. Grealish is someone who is going to be dealing with a lot of competition this season. You saw opportunities for example, Foden to come on and sub Grealish off in the Community Shield, and Foden looked a lot more interesting than Grealish. And when you're thinking about how players supply Haaland with the ball, I would say Grealish is much worse at creating chances for a forward who's making these great diagonal runs against the defense. Grealish is someone who I find he likes to tend to drive into that sort of area just outside the edge of the box, and he likes to sort of cut it back towards a midfielder as opposed to look for a progressive pass to someone like Haaland who's looking to slip in behind a defense. And that's kind of my gripe with Grealish as a player. As far as Barnes, I think he's a little one-dimensional as a player. He does really well, incredibly, when Vardy and Maddison are within the team, but Leicester's fixtures just aren't that good. And when you compare them to other players at other price points or similar price points with better fixtures, Barnes is definitely not someone I'd like to think about. If you were going to punt on a Leicester player, I'd much rather you go for Maddison because he definitely is the talisman for that team. As far as Coutinho, once again, he's someone who fell off a cliff really when it came to his production for this Aston Villa team at the end of the last season. And the fortunate thing for him was Buendia wasn't necessarily kicking on very well. This season you've had, or at least in the preseason so far, you've had someone like Bailey really stand out, whereas Coutinho hasn't really shown much. I think that will probably stay the same, and I'm expecting actually for Bailey to be the more interesting option, and he's at so much more of a cheaper price where I wouldn't even think about Coutinho at that point. At 8.0 to 8.5, Diaz, Saka, and Mount, I think they're both triple S tier options. This is simply because you have a lot of competing narratives, right? With Luis Diaz, you're competing with the Darwin Nunez spot, the Robertson spot, and ultimately Diaz for me is probably the best 8.0 mid. But not everyone is going to have that spot open for a Liverpool player. And therefore, you're going to be looking at other options like Saka and Mount. For Diaz as well, Mane leaving the club and Jota being not fit a shape of his life will definitely mean he's going to get a lot of expected minutes. And if you look at the stats last season for any Liverpool attacking player, you'll know that they have the best kind of expected stats. They are a very creative side. They're going to overwhelm a lot of teams just like they did last year, and Diaz is definitely going to benefit. One thing I will say is watching the way Diaz played with Firmino versus Darwin Nunez, I would actually say Diaz is more likely to be involved when Firmino is on the pitch. And that's a little worrisome for me if Darwin Nunez finds a lot of form and actually starts consistently versus Liverpool. I think Diaz starts to fall off in terms of production because of it, just because of how good Darwin is at occupying central spaces and how that means Diaz is slightly more pushed towards the left. When we contrast that to someone like, let's say, Saka, he is obviously another winger as well who does hug the right position, but he does find plenty of opportunities to move into the box. The penalty taker opportunity thing is a huge piece in the puzzle. I would say Saka is someone who you'd love to have in your team if you knew he was nailed on pens. It seems like Odegaard is intonating the same. I think he had a recent interview with the Norwegian press where he did mention that Saka seems to be the penalty taker at this point in time. On top of that, you kind of have to factor in age as well. You're probably expecting Saka to improve the most out of these three options. I would say the Chelsea squad is somewhere similar to where they were last season with the upgrade of Sterling, but some downgrades in, let's say, losing Rudiger, even though Koulibaly is a great replacement. As far as someone like Saka, this Arsenal team seemingly has improved a lot. I think Jesus raises the ceiling of the team. I think Zinchenko provides a lot of consistency and not even having to rely on someone like Nuno Tavares as an option. There are huge upgrades for this Arsenal team, even when we look at a depth perspective, even looking at the right back options. Now you've got Ben White playing there. You even have Saliba providing a lot of, I think, defensive cover that is much better than, let's say, the quality of Rob Holding waiting in the wings. And that really does improve how Arsenal are able to control games and therefore create possessive chances. Because what we saw last season was when they were playing with Partey and Xhaka, particularly as that double pivot in the midfield, was Arsenal were at their absolute best. And I really think that they've had a hot preseason. Saka is probably the one to watch. Mount is someone who is a little strange. I think once again he has that factor of being able to improve a lot this season. He's improved year on year as an FPL asset and as a football player in terms of his production from goals and assists. And when you look at that perspective, I think Mount has great fixtures as well. Slightly worse than Arsenal, and that's kind of what worries me. Their preseason hasn't been the hottest. They have had a bit of a turnover of squad, and Tuchel is still seemingly dissatisfied with a lot of players within this Chelsea team. So I would actually say that there is scope here to think about Mount as an option, but potentially later on. If you're confident in Chelsea's fixtures just because they're playing versus teams such as Everton and Leeds, and you think they're going to do incredibly well versus Tottenham because historically they have done so, and the lack of, let's say, Liverpool and City as looming threats between game weeks 1 to 8 is enough to satisfy you for going for Mount, then go for it. But I think all these options are really, really well matched. Maddison and Bowen for me just have slightly tougher fixtures. Bowen is at that weird price at 8.5 where it feels like added flexibility and added cost that you don't really want to deal with at the start of the season. I probably wouldn't invest too much money into Bowen, even though he was a fantastic asset. I did mention that at the start of the season when I was kind of looking at my tier list for midfielders, that he is incredibly well priced even from an efficiency point of view. I think he's actually well priced at 8.5. But when it comes to actually creating a draft template team, I'm not really sure whether a lot of us will actually churn out that extra 0.5 just to fit Bowen into our teams when there are such great options that have the potential to do better than they did last year, which is, I think, the case for Diaz, Saka, and Mount, and maybe less so the case for Bowen. Maddison is similar to that situation where I would say Leicester were performing much worse as a team than we expected in the previous year, and Maddison still had really, really fantastic results as a player and provided a lot to this Leicester team. Arguably, I would say once this slightly worse fixture run goes away for Leicester, you have great opportunities to move into Maddison as an asset, but definitely not one I'd like to start the season with at this point in time, which is why he's going to be in the A tier. As far as Foden and Mahrez, I just think the reason why I've put them and rated them so low at this point is because I think Grealish will start the season, probably Mahrez as well, and Foden will find minutes and probably take away the starting position from someone like Grealish eventually. But you also have Julian Alvarez as well, potentially rotating for Mahrez. He looked quite good in the Community Shield game. And that's the main problem. The lack of expected minutes, the threat of rotation. I just can't really justify going for options like Foden and Mahrez. And just like Grealish, just not that interested. I think Foden probably is the piece that I'd like to look at later in the season when he maybe finds a place in the starting 11 and kind of nails that down for himself. But because he missed preseason with this City team, I think that's the one thing drawing me away from saying that Foden's going to be a great pick to start the season with. Kulusevski, unfortunately, is going to be an avoid for me. I know he actually has a really, really good fixture versus Southampton, and I think Kulusevski will move all the way up into this tier list, maybe into the A or S tier later into the season. But right now, even though Richarlison's going to be missing game week 1, I just don't see how he has better fixtures when you compare them to the likes of Diaz, Saka, and Mount. And for me, the threat of rotation from someone like Richarlison, even though Richarlison is probably, I would say, an asset that is a rotation piece for Son, mostly to actually conserve Son's minutes. At the start of the season, I think he could actually be sharing a lot of minutes with someone like Kulusevski, and you still have an option like Lucas Moura who can take minutes away from Kulusevski. So I would say, even though Kulusevski is a great option, definitely not one to start the season with as well. As far as the midfield premiums, I think it's quite simple and quite cut out. It's going to be Salah and then De Bruyne and Son following within the next bracket. That's just to show that Salah is the best premium option in the game for me. I think you absolutely have to think about getting him in your team. I know a lot of people are considering Salah as drafts because it gives you that extra 1 million in the bank, or even 1.5 million if you're, I don't know, let's say tempted to go for a double 11.5 million structure. But for me, he's the one to get. He's the best fixtures. And the one thing I would say that maybe detracted me a little bit from Salah, as I said, is how good Darwin Núñez is at occupying central spaces. But his ability to actually cross from the wings, his penalty taker, spot for Liverpool not changing, I just think Salah is still the best option in the game. And that's pretty much what it comes down to. You have to pick a captain that you'd like to pick just for points as opposed to price efficiency. And that's what Salah is. Moving into the forwards, I think there's much less kind of diversity in these positions. Ultimately, a lot of us are going to be looking into getting the premiums into our team, because I think not many of us can confidently say we are going to bank into some of the championship teams and look at those kind of cheaper assets. Yes, you have some positions at the 7.0, 7.5 ranks, which I'll probably discuss the most about in terms of forwards. But if we start from the top, 4.5 options, it's going to be Archer, it's going to be Greenwood. Ultimately, Watkins and Ings for me aren't players that are at the ceiling that Aston Villa are looking for. Archer is someone who is going to be waiting in the wings and probably will find a lot of minutes over the course of the season, especially if Watkins and Ings continue to depress as they have in the preseason. Greenwood is another option to think about, but definitely just a rotation piece for this Leeds team. And unfortunately, with Gelhardt's pricing, you're not really going to be looking at him as a Leeds option. Moving on to the 6.0 to 6.5 options, Mitrovic is your absolute best option to go for. He is the most optimal pick, arguably, in the forward positions overall. But I really think a lot of managers will find themselves questioning whether they can actually trust that that is going to be the case. I think Mitrovic, Solanke, and Mbeumo are all interesting options. Mbeumo's not so much, because even though he's had the better preseason over Tony, I just think he's the second talisman. This team is probably not going to create as many chances as they did whilst Eriksen was in the team. So that's going to be someone like Mbeumo who's going to suffer from. Solanke and Mitrovic, they're definitely the talismans of the team, so definitely options to think about. But Bournemouth, their team, in my opinion, is quite weak. Fulham as well. And I just can't see them creating enough chances for options like Mitrovic and Solanke to be ones that we're really seriously thinking about, especially when you compare them to some of the defender premiums that we have in the game at this sort of price point. As far as players within the 7.0 to 7.5 price point, Tony is interesting because we did see Brentford actually improve in other areas outside of, I would say, the gap that Eriksen maybe would have left in the team from a creative point of view. But he has really good fixtures with his Brentford team, and if you are expecting them to once again perform like a mid-table team with him as a talisman, then he has scopes to say, or there is scope to say, that Tony's going to be a good option to start the season with. I think he's a really well-priced 7.0. You don't have the issue with Martial, so I have an asterisk with Martial where if, let's say, Ronaldo's leaving, or if Ronaldo doesn't seem like he's going to start because it seems like Ten Hag has even intonated that Ronaldo's not fit to play currently, then Martial could be a good option too, but you're also banking on, let's say, United stepping up a lot in terms of form, and then Martial actually being able to nail down that spot for himself. And that for me is a little bit of conjecture at this point in time. I can't really have any guarantees with this United team. It might take a while for them to kick things going, whereas Tony is playing with largely the same team, the same tactical structure and tactical philosophy, which should be quite easy for him to start the season off quite hot. And that's what makes Tony an S tier option for now, and Martial just an A tier option. Bamford and Wilson are also interesting. But I think with Wilson, one of the issues, once again, is going to be Newcastle sharing so many of the creative opportunities between a lot of their good and creative and talented even attacking players. With Bamford, he is going to be a talisman, but we've also seen Once again, Leeds being so poor last season, I think it just calls into question whether we can really trust in them as a team until we see just a little bit more from this Jesse Marsch team and whether they're actually able to kind of kick it this season. As far as Watkins, I really have rated him quite poorly as an asset. I know Watkins has really, really good fixtures, and it seems like he's someone who could bank a price rise very quickly if he gets a great game versus Bournemouth, which it seems like is inevitable because Bournemouth's defense is so poor, and the same thing with Everton. But I just don't rate him as an asset whatsoever. I think he is independently quite poor and was very wasteful last season, even though his expected goals per 90 minutes was good. Arguably, you could say Watkins is at a similar tier to options like Bamford and Wilson. I think he has a much lower peak compared to someone like Martial if Martial was getting a lot of minutes. And that's kind of simply what it comes down to. I just think that the Leeds and Newcastle team, when they actually provide consistent chances for players like Bamford and Wilson, we'll actually see them score consistent goals. Whereas with Watkins, I can't really say the same. As far as 8.0 options, Jesus is by far the best option for me, and Calvert-Lewin is quite a step behind. That's why he's in the B tier. As far as Jesus, as I said, he's just had such an exhilarating preseason. He scored 7 goals so far, even scoring a hat-trick in the scope of 15 minutes versus Nuremberg. So he's really started his Arsenal career well. I think one thing that he might struggle with is ultimately whether he's going to be able to consistently play 90 minutes a game if so much is demanded of him, because he's actually constantly moving on the pitch. I don't know if you've been watching him play, but he's even drifting out to the wings, doing his usual pressing stuff for United, or for City rather, and he is an absolute demon. But there is a lot that is demanded from someone in that role, and I think his stamina might be a question later on in the season, but definitely to start the season with that sort of ownership, I think, yes, he's going to be a shield, but no reason not to when he seems to be so well priced. As far as Havertz, another avoid option. Same with Calvert-Lewin. Calvert-Lewin, I think, is seemingly injured, so that asterisk might have to change. You have to think about that. I don't have the latest and up-to-date news with Calvert-Lewin, but it seems like he might be one to avoid as well. As far as Havertz, though, I just can't really see him having that electric season that people might expect for him, even if he is to move into the forward position. I just think he's not as aerially dominant as someone at his height should be. And even though he's quite technical with the ball and he makes intelligent runs here and there, I just think as a dominant player, he just doesn't justify that 8.0 price. And I think this Chelsea team have better options from attacking point of view, such as Sterling and such as Mount. And for now, I just can't really see the value in going for someone like Havertz. Moving into the next bracket, we're kind of looking at the pseudo premiums here within Darwin, Vardy, and Cristiano Ronaldo. Ronaldo's definitely an avoid with an asterisk. I mean, he seems like he needs some time to actually work fitness up, and we'll see what happens when United perform in the first few game weeks and whether he would be able to find a spot in this team and actually provide value as a 10.5 option. Right now, I just don't see that being the case. As far as Vardy, I think he's a great differential to start the season with. But at that sort of price point, why not just look at Darwin Nunez instead? If your third Liverpool spot is still unoccupied, I really think he could be an option to move into because he's so hard to reach in that price point where if you are a Maverick and you absolutely want to go differential, I think Darwin presents an opportunity that a lot of people will miss. At that 8.0 price point where a lot of people have locked down Jesus, paired with someone like Haaland or Kane at 11.5, it's really hard to actually move into a 9.0 option from Liverpool, especially since a lot of people will actually start the season with Robertson and Diaz, and that's going to make it a double transfer at the very, very minimum to move into someone like Nunez. You can't just simply downgrade someone like Haaland and Kane into Darwin, and that's why he's at such an interesting price point. I have to say he's going to look like an S tier option for me if he continues to play and create chances for himself in the same way that he did in the Community Shield match. And mind you, that is basically the second best defense or even first best defense within the Premier League. So that's food for thought. 11.5, I think Haaland Kane is actually very, very tightly matched, and the ownership probably actually suggests the exact same. Haaland provides a great captaincy option within Game Week 2 versus Bournemouth. As we mentioned, Bournemouth is a team definitely to target at the start of the season. If we look at options, even Haaland, let's say, in his toughest game possible, which was actually Liverpool in the Community Shield. Yes, he completely fluffed a chance in front of goal, but he still made a lot of chances for himself, got a 1.6 XG for that game versus the toughest opponent possible. Versus Bayern Munich, he was able to kind of find an easy tap in for himself, created by KDB and Grealish. I just think Haaland is the type of player where as the City team does better and better, he's going to improve as well, but independently, he's someone who can create chances for himself, and I think even from the start, when you're looking at that Bournemouth game, just such an interesting option to own, stay ahead of the curve. As far as Kane, I think he actually has the best pairing with Salah when it comes down to, if you'd like to go off template and not go for a Salah captaincy for the first 8 game weeks, basically, Kane provides the best opportunities to kind of pair up as another competing captaincy option. On top of that, you have the game week 1 captaincy option just immediately to think about. And just that Southampton fixture probably is a little bit more interesting compared to Haaland. I know a lot of people in booking transfers thinking about even going for Kane in game week 1 and then moving straight into Haaland. Do you actually want to do that? Probably not. And if you're someone who actually is interested in Kane, I imagine you probably might even stick with him beyond game week 1 and move into thinking about using Kane as an asset in game weeks 3 and 4, where those are arguably some tough games for City as well. Crystal Palace have been a bogey team for City for a while. Newcastle quite good at home, even though City did crumple them last time out. And then Wolves and Nottingham Forest arguably easier teams to target for someone like Kane. So it really comes down to what you're rating as well. The preseason has gone much better for Kane. He's had a lot more minutes. He's playing under the same manager, where he enjoyed a lot of success near the back half of the season, and looks like he's going to start the season quite hot. Whereas with Haaland, I think you're hoping that he'll continue to find himself in the correct positions, and you're trusting in him as a player and his ability to be more clinical, arguably, than the Community Shield game. And that's kind of how the forwards are going. Moving on to the defenders, I think these positions are much easier to decipher. And as I said, just because we have so many great teams and so many great fullbacks amongst the top 6 teams, it has become a little bit homogenous in terms of the template, where a lot of us are going for the same options. And I think ultimately that is justified. When you're looking at clean sheets and the way defenders earn points, that is the most important value first. And then we look at their attacking returns and who's going to provide both these top 6 teams. So with the 4.0 options, you're just looking at someone who plays consistently for 90 minutes. That's going to be Nico Williams and also Patterson. Patterson is someone who you're not 100% guaranteed about, as Everton are a team that might even find rotation with Seamus Coleman coming back into the side potentially at one point in the season, especially if Patterson has a poor game or two. With Nico Williams, I think Nottingham Forest don't have that sort of abundance of options, where he definitely is someone that I would expect to play consistently for 90 minutes. And that's specifically why he was loaned out. As far as 4.5 options, Arsenal options for me are the best just because their fixtures are so good, but their defenders are still well priced around that 4.5 to 5.0 tier. So therefore, White and Saliba for me are very, very good picks. I think personally, I would say that Saliba is someone who looks like a menacing option if he manages to nail that starting spot and if he shows some sort of goal threat. But over the course of his career, you'll actually see that he hasn't scored many goals ultimately in league competition, and that's kind of a worrisome thing for someone at his size. As far as White, you could even see him playing right back, so I think he's going to be the best option to start with if you're looking for a 4.5 Arsenal option. He could be playing right back at times. He has shown very, very good diagonal crosses, not necessarily to create assistive chances, but at least something that could provide him with bonus points, which I think is something that he was quite good at doing for last season. As far as Johnny, Dunk, and Dello, they're all 3 different types of options that I would say provide a lot of value. I would say Johnny is someone who, especially with Wolves being such a good defensive team, he's a little bit of a double-edged sword where he can provide a little bit from attacking returns, as we saw in the back half of last season when he kind of inserted himself into the team. And on top of that, we know Wolves are quite a defensively formidable team. As far as Dunk, you're looking for pure goal returns. He didn't have the best season last year. Yes, he was injured at various points and he found himself as the starter as per usual for the back half of the season, but he didn't score as many goals as in the 2021 season. And I think that's sort of the main issue that you're looking at. Ultimately, if you're expecting Brighton to do well, and you might want to look at these fixtures early on that Brighton have that are actually quite good, with exception to the United game, and you see Dunk as an opportunity to play off the bench, he could be quite interesting, but I don't really see the opportunity there. As far as Dalot, he's that sort of high ceiling prospect where, as a fullback for a United team that we hopefully expect to do well, just like Shaw did last season and presented us as an option after the Euros, you're once again looking at another asset who plays in very highly involved offensive positions. But there is a huge threat, I would say, from the clean sheets perspective of whether this United's team have actually kind of overcome a huge hurdle in becoming once again a good defense. And I really don't see how the signs are there for us to say United are going to be a fantastic defense from the start. And as I said, most of the points earned by fullbacks at the end of the day are coming from things like clean sheets. So you really need that sort of guarantee for me to go into an option like Dalot. Otherwise, why not just save that money and go for a 4.0 option? As far as 5.0 to 5.5, I think Perisic and Gabriel are the best options. I've actually left out Zinchenko here because really in my estimations, I think Gabriel is a much more interesting punt to go for as a 5.0 Arsenal option. I guess you can say this is going to be Gabriel dash Zinchenko if you really believe in Zinchenko. But don't just pick a fullback because they're a fullback. Zinchenko is someone who probably will occupy that sort of left mid area as opposed to the left wing area that a lot of people are interested in when they go for, let's say, a fullback option. When you compare it to the likes of someone like Cancelo, who plays extremely inverted and plays at very, very upfront positions. As far as Zinchenko's concerned, if you look at his heat maps within the preseason games, he doesn't really move into central areas. Martinelli and Jesus are players who occupy those left wing areas, and that kind of takes away from him. Gabriel, on the other hand, is one of the key aerial threats from the previous season, and I think he has shown over the last 2 years that he is a huge aerial threat across the entire of Europe, and I can't really see that being entirely different with Gabriel this season. So I really do expect Gabriel to do well, and that's why I've classified him as a very good 5.0 option. As far as Perisic at 5.5, it's all about expected minutes for him. I think he's actually an option that we'll all eventually move into later into the season if he nails his spot in the team. But it did seem like even in the Roma game, even though he showed a lot of his quality that we've seen previously, if you've been watching Croatia or even Inter Milan in the last few years, or even his, let's say, loan to Bayern Munich recently, Perisic is a fantastic player, but he hasn't had the preseason that you'd like, where I would say he's going to start the first few games for Tottenham and play 90 minutes consistently. Perhaps Conte will end up going and doing that, but I think Perisic still needs to build a little bit of form. I think Ryan Sessegnon will take a few minutes away from him. That Chelsea game is a little bit tough, so why not think about Perisic, as an option in game week 3. However, he is still at an incredibly good price, right? So at 5.5, you arguably are going for one of the best options in the game, who could end up being worth the valuation of, let's say, 6.5 mil, 7 mil, because Spurs were so good at keeping clean sheets last season. So that's kind of why I feel like Perisic still has to be an S tier option. As far as Walker, he's just someone who doesn't really provide many attacking returns, but is at a very, very good cut rate price for this City team. He's cheaper than Ederson, as an example, at 5.5. So that could be a really good option to think about. So definitely Walker is one to watch. But with the potential of, let's say, City rotating, because Walker is someone who Pep Guardiola understands needs rest, and some of the fullback options for this Man City team performing quite well coming from the academy for City, I just think maybe Walker is the option that I wouldn't really want to trust and start the season with ultimately. As far as Dean and Cash, I just don't like Aston Villa's chances of getting clean sheets. I think they will play attacking football like they did last season, and I just didn't like their chances of getting clean sheets. Even though Diego Carlos is in the team, I think they'll still suffer from the defensive end at times. Diego Carlos is someone who, for me, similar to Mings, has one or two mistakes in him. He is someone who gives penalties, a little bit rash as well with his sort of frame. Dean and Cash is an interesting kind of comparison, right? You have Dean, who's a little bit more of the crosser type, a little bit more creative when it comes to expected assists. Cash is the much better finisher, and someone who actually looks to get onto the end of balls, and has shown us in the previous season that he has the ability to move into the box and actually score from pivotal chances. Whether you actually want to start the season with these assets is probably another question. I'd probably move away from them for now. Trippier is for me only in the A tier simply because the fixtures are tough. You have City and Liverpool in the first 5 games, and unlike someone like Pope, who you could rotate potentially with Ward now, you don't have that opportunity. And Trippier is someone who I wouldn't really want to start the season with at 5.0 just because of those 2 fixtures. If he didn't have such a, I'd say, ugly fixture run, especially in the defensive position, where I would say you were expecting to pick a defender and keep them for at least maybe 6 to 7 game weeks at any one time, at that sort of price point. So for me, I just can't justify going for Trippier at the start. I think a lot of teams have moved into incorporating Trippier. He has gotten a lot of assists in the preseason. He also is someone who takes set pieces. Not many fullback can actually say that they do that, with exception to someone like Trent or even Reece James at times. But yeah, that's kind of the double-edged sword with Trippier for now, and I think why I'd probably move towards the avoid camp. As far as Doherty and Ake, I think Doherty is a class below Perisic, and I think Ake is someone who will probably very, very quickly be deposed by another City asset, namely someone like Stones, or let's say when Laporte is actually back fit in September. So I can't see the permanence of Ake being in your team, and therefore, why even bother? I think just go for someone like Walker, who you probably expect to get more minutes and consistent starts for City. The one upside I would say Ake has in the short term is he's looked incredible attacking set pieces early on in the preseason. The Bayern Munich game, he could have actually scored the goal that Haaland scored. He was also very close to providing another opportunity from a diagonal through ball to Haaland. He also was, just in general in the Community Shield, someone who definitely looked like a goal threat from a set piece action. And that's maybe the one upside that Ake has that as a differential. But I think it's a big gamble there, and a position at 5.0 if you're looking for a City player that you'd like to nail down for more than 3 to 4 game weeks at one time. As far as the 6.0 to 7.5 options, I really think there's actually not much to discuss between Trent, Robertson, James, Cancelo, and Diaz. These are options that we've time and time again seen to be really, really good value. The reason why Diaz is ahead of Van Dijk and Matip is just because I think Robertson and Trent are there occupying those 2 defensive spots. And if you already occupy those 2 defensive spots for Liverpool, I just can't see why you'd go for a Van Dijk or a Matip at this point in time. I think it just makes a lot more sense to go for those options and then think about Van Dijk and Matip as secondary options. As far as Cancelo and Diaz, I think they just get more expected points compared to players like Walker, who don't get many goal involvements, or someone like Ake, who could be rotated out of the team. You get a lot of expected minutes out of Diaz that you probably wouldn't with someone like Matip, as an example, who's much cheaper than the rest here. And when you compare it to another option like Van Dijk, I think the tricky thing here is simply Van Dijk's worth as an asset is predicated upon the goal scoring through set pieces, whereas there's much more, I'd say, consistency that you can lean from, at least with Robertson and Trent. And Robertson being someone who in particular did very well with Luis Diaz joining the team. And so I expect that to be exactly the same this season. As far as Chilwell, huge asterisk on him with the Cucurella transfer potentially being impending. And that's basically what's stopping him from being a good asset. Ultimately, Reece James is at the same price. So why even bother looking at someone like Chilwell, who hasn't even featured very much in the preseason and has had Alonso and even Emerson take a lot of minutes away from him. Last position is actually going to be the goalkeepers. Usually this is actually a discussion that can be done in 30 seconds, but this season I think there's been a lot of diversity being created by FPL because they have deliberately priced the premium keepers just a touch cheaper than in the previous year. And I think that's what makes the goalkeeper so interesting. You now have Ward as a 4.0 option, 100% stick him onto your team sheet, just for the chance of getting the Leicester starting keeper at 4.0. And then at 4.5, you're looking at options now who are also impacted by Ward. As I said, with 4.5 options, you have the option of actually rotating now with potentially a Leicester keeper. So Sanchez, for me, has already shot up to the charts as a really, really good goalkeeper pair with Ward, which is why he is now considered, for me, at least as an S tier asset. In the next tier, I've actually got Meslier and Raya. What I don't like about Meslier is 100% how are Leeds going to get clean sheets until they actually find a little bit of defensive stability? Their fixtures are really, really good, and Messi is someone who has shown historically, at least the 2021 season, to get a huge propensity of saves and get a lot of points through that. But I can't really justify it when they don't get any clean sheets whatsoever. And as I said, with the Cagliari game, when I was watching them in the preseason, they were more likely to actually concede 3 goals than to concede the 2 that they actually did. And that's really worrisome for me from that perspective. As far as Raya, he just has a little bit of, I think, dampening of the X minutes because Strakosha is someone who has joined the team coming from Lazio last season. And what worries me is Raya is running his contract down seemingly, and Brentford are probably going to set themselves up to move into Strakosha next year. But eventually, maybe, or even at an early point in the season, if let's say Raya makes a mistake, there could be a scope for Strakosha to already take that spot away from him. The manager as well has already talked about the opportunity for all the keepers at Brentford's disposal to fight for this number 1 spot, something you don't actually see managers discuss very, very often, and that kind of hurts me. But I would say within kind of Brentford fan forums, it seems like Raya definitely is the much better keeper just in terms of pure quality, and probably if Brentford were to maximize their abilities to win games, Raya is going to be the one to start. So if you want to kind of gamble on that upside and you think he's going to be nailed, then definitely Raya could be an S tier option. Pickford is once again another option similar in the Meslier camp, where he has slightly worse games in comparison, and for me, an equal opportunity to get a terrifically low amount of clean sheets, so just can't really see him as an option. As far as 5.0, I think Ramsdale and Mendy are definitely the 2 best options at this point, just because of the way the season works. You could go for an early wild card. I think Ramsdale and Mendy definitely do have the better fixtures when you compare to Sa and Pope. Sa is someone who did extremely well as a goalkeeper last season, but I can't really see him continuing that form. We did see Wolves, for example, drop off a little bit of a cliff from the defensive point of view. They were actually overperforming their defensive statistics, right? So they got a lot more clean sheets than we would have naturally expected, and I think the pattern is sort of regressing to the mean, and Wolves are probably going to perform more like the team that we expect, whereas Arsenal and Chelsea are still, in my opinion, formidable defenses with really good fixtures. So definitely a little bit better there, even though they might get less saves than a keeper like Sa. As far as Pope, he is someone who has tough fixtures, right? Liverpool and City are tough fixtures. You might even say that Pope could be someone who is a little bit more interesting because you have the option of rotating with Ward, right? If you look at, let's say, when Pope has Man City, you could have Ward as a Southampton keeper as well, or playing versus Southampton, sorry, in game week 3 at home. So those are good opportunities to even think about, let's say, the Pope and Ward rotation. But do you really want to be rotating with a 5.0 and a 4.0 keeper? I think you'd probably rather just stick with that 5.0 keeper at that point. I feel like at that sort of price point and at that sort of range, you're probably already banking in going for a keeper such as Pope and looking at the long run. And I think even when you look at game weeks 1 to 8 overall, Ramsdale and Mendy definitely far surpass and succeed him in that aspect, even if you were to have Ward coming off the bench. As far as Alisson and Ederson, those are the 2 best options at 5.5. Your Reese really isn't a factor for me. He's an avoid. I mean, if he was on this list, he would be an avoid anyways. And for me, Alisson's the best option because he's the most price optimal pick. But probably no one actually has the opportunity to move into Alisson. And ultimately, the thing about Alisson is you want to actually spend as much money as into Liverpool players as possible because we know that they're so valuable and they return so well on an average kind of per million basis, right, per player. So it makes more sense actually to invest into someone like Robertson if you wanted to go for a Liverpool defender as opposed to an Alisson because he's actually much more worth money in your team because a Liverpool player should be the first names on your team sheet. As far as Ederson, I think he's at that sort of similar camp where because City have such a good clean fixture run, you could see a lot of clean sheets there that could make Ederson a very, very good short-term asset. If you don't see yourself redistributing too much funds early in the season and you don't want to book too many transfers and you want to play a bit more of a, let's say, no transfer approach, and be cautious and evaluate early in the season, then I think Ederson's a fantastic pick. But moving into the 5.5 and even 5.0 territory when you have a 4.0 keeper, I think is a little bit of a reach for managers who are more interested in catching the upside early on. And that's kind of simply what it comes down to with the keepers. Thank you guys so much for watching the cheat sheet video. I know it was an incredibly long video, but there's a lot of assets to think about in Game Week 1. There's a lot more variants, a lot more variables to think about. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.